I wasn't so much in contact personally with Bruce Ario, but he was writing for my website, Automachination, the last few months, right? And I mean, he's always had like a very kind of distinctive um voice, right? He like even though he wasn't like an essayist or whatever, you could tell immediately just reading the website that his stuff just sounds different from my stuff, from Jessica's stuff, right? Just like Jessica's stuff would sound different from everybody else's, right? So he's always had this very, very distinct quality. And the first time that I talked to him like over videos when we did that show last year, with the healthcare show and all that stuff that was going on in the winter in Texas. And I mean, he's one of these people that definitely has a very kind of distinctive presence, right? This is true interpersonally. This is true in his art. And I think that one of the biggest things that we'll be missing now without Bruce is just the fact that he's someone that dealt with a ton of mental health issues his entire life, most of his life rather, and most people that deal with mental health issues, like many of them don't end up coming out of it right positively to the other end, and B, many don't end up creating on such a high level, right? He was able to, whether he was able to harness some of that energy or whether there was something else going on top of that, right? It never seems to have like really damaged like an actual like artistic output, right? So, and whenever he would talk about his mental illness, one of the things that I noticed is compared to maybe some of the kind of discussions you see on Twitter or whatever with people that have mental illnesses, or you mentioned like when we were doing that thing with CITYBOY last year, you mentioned some of the channels that you would follow, and some of the people there, they would sort of use their mental illness as a kind of like blunt weapon, right, against others, right? They would invoke their mental illnesses in order to, be above others in some way, whether it's like a means of bullying others or, feeling like they could maybe speak on things that they might not have any expertise on. And Bruce never ever did that, right? He was very mature about it. He said, "Look, I was listening to that biorama that he did with you." And he was like, "Look, like my mental illness, like I just recognized from the very beginning, it was voices telling me things that weren't true, right? And I had to deal with the fact that they weren't true. And I had to understand that they weren't true, that I had to come to terms with that. And I had to be a creator, right? Despite this fact." So these are just like some of the things that I appreciate about Bruce.
Well, Bruce, I met him in 1993. I think he said 92 in your article. It was actually 93 because I met him at a poetry reading, and I didn't go till then till 93 for the first year and a half or so. I was in Minneapolis. Bruce was almost 10 years older than me. He was born in April of 1955. He died August 6th of this year, so he was 67. I'm 57. I only know one person who didn't like Bruce, and that was a psychopathic guy who came to my poetry group, but he didn't like me. He didn't like basically any of the regulars at the UPG. Other than that, I don't know anyone who ever said anything bad about him or had anything bad to say about him. Bruce did have problems. He had he was drug use. He had when he was young. He had alcoholism. He had a number of things. I know. I don't know if he spoke about it in the biorama, but I'll just mention it. He had a thing about women's nylons.
Yeah, he
Um,
mentioned that when we discussed CITYBOY
yeah,
publicly, right?
yeah,
So
yeah,
this is public, yeah.
yeah. So he he had that, and I don't know if you consider that somewhat transvestism or something, but um, all of these things, though, he always was moving towards something, whether he was writing a page a day of something or whether he was, and he never got discouraged. Uh, he would fail 100 times in writing a poem, and then he would try again, and he'd write something brilliant. Now, literally, Bruce was the most scattershot artist you can imagine. I mean, he was born in 1955. Remember, he started out a chapter in a book of his, not City Boy, but another book that he sent that it started with something like, she was an attractive negress. And this was written in like 2001 or 2002 or whatnot. I said, Bruce, it's probably best to not be calling black women negresses. But that's the way he was raised. I mean, in Minneapolis, they called half black people mulattoes, and even called them quadroons and octoroons too when I first got there in '91. So Minneapolis, despite its liberal reputation, racially was well behind the times. And as we've seen with George Floyd stuff, that shouldn't be that surprising. But he was always he was indefatigable in some ways. There's a video that Jessica had found of him working at his church, doing a little 2 or 3 minute video for the United Methodist Church, and it's one of those sad things that he never found the love in the sexual sense. I mean, not that I think he had a few girlfriends here or there, but he never found that long time love. He never was able to reproduce. And I think he was smart enough. I think he once told me that he didn't really want kids after he got through the stuff, but he wanted to have someone to share life with. And he's one of those people that never happened for. There were a few other people in the Minneapolis art scene of the 1990s, the early O's, that I'm glad that they didn't find someone, because they were not particularly people who were stable or good people. But Bruce was, and he was always there. Now, I do remember one time there was this. We used to have the Uptown Poetry Group at a place called the Steeple People, and one time the owner of the Steeple People towed Jess's and my car, even though we had gone there many times, and that was the last time we went there. And Bruce was scared to say anything to this guy. I forget the guy's name. He had a weird name who owned the place, but I didn't really hold it against Bruce. Bruce was not the kind of person who would put himself in any kind of situation where he could be exposed to some kind of, I guess, retribution or whatnot. But by the same token, he was someone who would go out, and he worked with his church. I know he traveled here and there to Haiti most prominently, and to some other places around the country, helping people out. And I will say, from what little I heard, so people know, because Bruce had mental illness, this probably in some way led to this situation of his death. Not in the actual death, which, from what I was told, he fell in his bathroom and hit his head on the bathtub, and presumably, hopefully, he knocked himself out and didn't suffer that much. And then he didn't show up the next day, Sunday, for his church duties, and then the day after that he didn't show up to work, and that's when people were alerted. Now, he did have, apparently, and this upset Jess as much as the death, that he didn't take particularly good care of himself physically, and didn't take care of his apartment. Apparently, the apartment was very dirty, and there were apparently people that were called in by the owner of. He had his condo, but the owner of the building apparently called some people in to clean things up because there was a stench. So you often hear about, the crazy old cat lady, or people as they get older, they just, I wouldn't say lose touch with reality, but he wasn't aware of the surroundings he was in, and it's unfortunate that it ended that way for him. But looking at the scope of the last 29 years, almost 3 decades that I knew him, he was someone that brought so much positivity into the world, not to mention some great art. City Boy is a great novel. It's the only work of fiction of his, of prose, that's really worth any appraisal and study. He probably has maybe 2-3 dozen great Ario poems, his own 10-line form of 3, 3, 3, and 1. I know you have a poem that you wrote in an Ario form, and we can talk a little bit more about that when you read it. So, I mean, hopefully people like me and you and Jessica and others that knew him, hopefully, as time goes on, who knows what. I know you have in the back of your mind wanting to someday start a press. Bruce Ario's collected poems and his I'm his literary executive too. His collected poems or selected poems and his re-releasing City Boy. It's with some publisher. I've got to find out who that bowdlerized. Jessica made a statement once. Bruce, I think he was talking to Jessica once on the phone or something. It might have been on the phone, and he said something to the effect like, "Yeah, I don't know how City Boy, instead of being one word, was changed to two by this public. I don't know how I let them talk me into it." Jessica said, "They used words, Bruce. They used words."
I thought you said that, but I mean, it doesn't matter.
No, but
Um,
yeah, and so he always wanted to please people, and sometimes to his detriment. And there were people who took advantage of him. This person I won't name, who didn't like him, tried to take advantage of him. He didn't, but he took advantage of some other people. But anyway, that's sort of for anyone who's never seen Bruce Ario. Maybe when you do your piece, you can link to the Biorama thing too, as well as maybe the one or two interviews you did with Bruce.
Yeah, yeah, and it's one of those strange things, right? If near the end of his life, he was maybe in some ways not totally aware of his surroundings. Like you can't though really say something like divorced from reality, because I mean he continued to write well. He sent you some great arios like just within the last few years, right? When he spoke about his mental ills, he was like, "Oh, Alex, like, can you put this a note in front of your video so that people don't get the wrong idea that I'm not glorifying anything," right? He's very, very aware of those things. And even, interpersonally, I remember like a couple months ago, he sent you an email, something along the lines of, Dan, like, you've always encouraged me, like you've always done these things for me, and you saw my talents when everybody else had written me off, right? So he was able to understand these things about himself. He was able to see positives in other people, right? He would send me emails, and he would, continue to try to reach out, but he would always, consistently give back, right? He's even though I've never actually physically met him outside of these kinds of interactions, he strikes me as, probably one of the kindest people that I've ever met in my life, right? That I've ever known. Um, and
And the thing is too, I mentioned, and I mentioned it to Jessica. There have been people that have asked my help in the past, and I've tried to give it to them. And then one way or another, they don't want it or they reject it, which is fine. That's their way to do it. But Bruce would listen, and then he'd listen to someone else, unfortunately, and sometimes screw things up. But there was an appreciation to being heard there, and that would be one thing if I just said that. But like I've said and you just said, he was able to write of quality. It's I did a play recently on Hazel Hall. I did 4 poets plays, and I'm probably going to do a run of other poet plays, probably James Emanuel and Weldon Keys and a few others on my mind, along with some historical plays. But Bruce was at his best if you edit it down to his top 40 or 50 poems. He's going to stand out quite well. Now, it would be great if everything was. I mean, he probably had to write 4,000 poems that were, execrable in some ways to mediocre at best. But those top 30 or 40 arios that he wrote, and maybe a handful of non-arios that he wrote, are a legacy that he was mentally ill. Hazel Hall was a paraplegic, so she's become sort of a heroine in a minor sense for people like that. People in Oregon know that. Bruce would probably be considered a regional writer. He was very much about Minnesota, but that doesn't mean that you can't write something great. The novel City Boy, and if his family ends up sending me some other stuff, it'll probably take a year or two of my going through it in between my own works to sort it out, and then maybe make a selected poems or selected arios or something. And the aerial form is is a form. It's a free verse form, but it's in its own way as powerful as the sonnet form, any of the sonnet forms. And well, you're looking for your area there. You're going to read it.
No, I'm actually looking at his poems. Because so like I got this email from Dan that Bruce had died just a couple of days ago, right? And the first thing I did was I went to the Cosmoetica website and I printed out his interview right with you. I printed out all the poems that were available of his on the site, and I spent like the night just kind of going through it, rereading. Um, because I want people to like understand the following, like people that are fans of the channel, they might already know this, but maybe people that are watching this in the church where this is being played, or maybe some of his relatives, um maybe they don't truly understand what we mean when we say that at his best he was a great writer. But I mean, he really, really was, right? We're not just saying this because we were friendly with him, or because he contributed to our respective websites or channels or whatever. I mean, at his best, he was truly, a great poet, right? And this is, I'm sure, the way that he himself would want himself to be seen, right, after he was dead, right? This is the legacy that he wished to leave behind. It wasn't, to the extent that he was helping out people in his church and he was doing a lot of just like wonderful community work. All that is fine, but I think long term he also really wanted to be seen as someone that was valuable, right, in the literary space too. And I really hope that people watching this will take the time to read some of this, some of these arios, right, read some of this work, go through some of these interviews, and try to understand why we're saying what we're saying, and that we're not just talking words. I mean, let me give like a one example of something that he wrote, right? So this is a poem called Pickings, and for anybody listening, I'm going to have each of these poems appear on the screen so that you could also read it. So it's called Pickings, and this is in the Ario form, right? We have 3 lines, 3 lines, 3 lines, and then a final line, and these are all kind of like discrete units that have like a sum total. Sensitively rendered ones are good, and the unexpected ones as well. I especially like bright, shiny ones. Oftentimes, I must stoop to get them or grasp them out of the air, but that's hard if it's windy. Some graciously appear of their own right, while others are dug out, pulled, stretched, or excavated. It's the getting I'm after, right? So, we have this gradual buildup, right? He could be talking about poetry. He could be talking about thoughts, right? He could be talking about something else altogether. Each of these lines ends, and he doesn't do this that often in his poetry, but each of these lines ends in a period, right? So everything is this kind of, equally weighted, discrete little unit. And it's this kind of like end process, right? Most artists, unfortunately, don't think in these terms, right? It's the getting I'm after, right? It's the process of. If you understand that it's the process of, the gulf between you creating art that is not so good versus very good and great might not be as intimidating as it seems if you sort of give yourself into this kind of like gamified process of creating art, which Bruce did a lot of.
Yeah, Bruce is not a Henry Dodger type. He's not someone who just stayed holed up like in his own little apartment and wrote this, 20 million word fantasy shit where he was copying other people's words and copying other people's art and put it together. And just because he's mentally ill, let's make a documentary and make him famous as a what I guess you'd call found artist or a street artist or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
want to call him. Bruce was actively engaged in the world. And I know, Jessica, there's a poem, I've got to find it. Jessica, there's a poem where he talks about the moon and it ends up from the words from there to there, how the
Yeah,
moon
I
shifts.
I have it here. I'm going to read that too.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And the thing with City Boy, I'm hoping that I, there'll be a copy of the Boy file somewhere in the digital assets from 1999 before Bruce screwed it up, because Jessica remembers some of the endings that Bruce blunted down because, again, he listened to people who didn't know a fucking thing about art. And it's a shame. I do know that his brother told me that he doesn't know if the people who were cleaning out the apartment might have thrown something out. This would be terrible because let's say I do have, Bruce had sent me a whole Lexar stick worth of stuff a couple of years ago, and there's it's varying quality, but a lot of the great areas are there, maybe 25, 30 of them. It would be a shame if another 25 or 30 had been written, and in his own lapse, his own laxness in saving things, he only had printed copies, and some cleaner came and cleaned it out. This is why it's important. And when I die, or before then, I'll probably look to you to be my literary executor. James Emanuel didn't do it, as far as I know. It's one of the things for artists, prepare, realize that your own work hopefully should go beyond you, survive you. Bruce,
Mm-hmm.
because Bruce, I think, was so much into the everyday, he didn't do that. Yeah, he did it to an extent. As I said, he sent these things to me, so he had some awareness. Hopefully there's some other hidden gems out there. But
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I'm interested in seeing what you find, right? Just to see what it would be like to put everything together. So this is the Ario about the moon, and I remember this was like sent back in what 2016, 2017. So this was fairly recent, right?
right, it seems to
Yeah,
be.
yeah. Just as it was, the moon isn't quite the way it was last month. It was over there, and it seemed lighter in the sky. But I am on the same bus bench as I have been for some time now, whether tonight or the last 30 years. Change seems so difficult, genuine change. Anybody can change clothes, but few can move the moon from there to there.
Yeah, and it's a simple idea of a paradox, someone living in their own world and something has changed within them. It might not be the physical moon that he's seeing differently, or maybe we are looking from the speaker's eyes. It's not necessarily Bruce, but it's those little things that I will tell you, at his best, Bruce Ario is the equal of Hazel Hall, who's someone I have championed at her best, being the equal of Emily Dickinson. Now, of the 1,800 or so poems that Emily Dickinson wrote and published, she has, I would say 15, 20, 25, maybe you could argue 30 great little poems. But Bruce has at least that many as well. And, maybe he wrote 2 or 3 times as much as she did. I don't know. But if we're talking at the peak, the best things that he wrote, he's up there. At his best, he's not up there with a Walt Whitman. He's not up there with a Wallace Stevens or a Hart Crane or these more technically gifted wordsmiths. But if we're talking just pure numbers, there are only literally maybe a few dozen people, maybe not even 100 people in the history of our species that have as many great little pieces of art. Again, there are only 10 lines. It's not like he was, writing, some long a Wordsworthian ballad. But he probably has as many great poems as Wordsworth did. Maybe not as many words as Wordsworth had in his best poems, but he probably doesn't have the dead spots either that Wordsworth sometimes has, even in something like Tintern Abbey. Yeah. So, and the thing with the Ario and with your poem that you're going to read, we were talking about it or mentioned it, is that you can write excellent poems in that 3-3-3-1 free verse style, but the thing that made an Ario great, and I think one of his airs, the best ones, was when virtually every line had a cliche in it, but it constantly was like each cliche put a different spin on the cliche before and uncliched it.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't find that in what he sent me. I'm going to have to go into a deep dive over the next couple of years. Hopefully that poem isn't lost. But the general area was each of the 3 stanzas, there'd be a setup, there'd be some action, there'd be a seeming little resolution or come to, and then the last line almost had a Twilight Zone little spin on what was there, and
Mhm.
it wasn't just that it was different, and it just wasn't deliberately just to put a spin on it, but in Bruce's own mind, there would be that Keatsian negative capability. Something he would just smash these two things together, and it would be unlike anything else. And I've tried. I wrote probably a handful of Arios, and they were good to very good, maybe even excellent poems, but they weren't Bruce Ario Arios.
Yeah.
Bruce Ario was the creator and the master of the Ario
Yeah.
at his best.
And when I read my Ario that I wrote yesterday, actually, I'm gonna get into like maybe why that is, but I have one more Ario that is my favorite one from Bruce, at least of the ones that I've read. And this I also remember sometime in the last few years, right? And this kind of speaks to that Keatsian negative capability, right? At the end, right? Total like twist on what came, and also some of these cliches that he just twists and plays with line by line. It's titled "Where Has It Gone?" Burning up the calendar like a gas guzzling SUV, I look over my shoulder, realizing no ultimate politeness will bring back the summer, and I could have never saved even a blade of grass to blow a whistle, stop the game. No, no, it's time to gather poles. Right. And I mean, just with that last line, right? There's different ways you can interpret it. Immediately, what comes to my mind is this idea of we're gathering things that maybe don't necessarily belong together. We're going to make them work in some way, right? This is a nice metaphor for, some of these final lines that he has in his poetry. But, and the whole thing is just so
And what
unbelievable.
was it? Gathering bulbs or gathering poles?
Poles,
Yeah.
poles.
And the interesting, he brings in the blade of grass, which obviously has the Whitman-esque thing there. And
Hmm.
I can tell you that's one of the things. This is where the negative capability comes in, because that opens up a vista. I can tell you, Bruce probably wasn't aware of that. He wasn't harking back to Whitman deliberately, probably there. But that whole thing puts the reader in a state of mind uh, that that there's something grand that possibly could come, which sets up that final twist at the end there. And so it's someone I probably, maybe when I'm old, if I get a chance and I'm not that able to create anymore, if I'm 85 or 90, maybe I can do a deeper dive analysis of Bruce's aerial form and why this aerial works, that doesn't work. But there you see that even though Bruce probably didn't intend it, you can see where things seep in to art and from other art, even if the artist is not aware of that.
Hmm. Yeah. Um, yeah, I mean, even if there's none of that sort of, uh, uh, it's still kind of like visceral, semi-awareness, you could say, right? If you read enough poetry, if you've written enough poetry, some of these things just kind of like make sense, even if you don't know necessarily that something works, right? I can imagine him in situations where he just puts something together and it seems like it really works to him, and then he sends it to you, for that critique, like, okay, is this worthwhile? Is it not? Right? There's still something working there in the background, and over time, right, the more that you read, the more that you write, these instincts, right, they do become honed, right? He is somebody that continued to write well, right? No matter how old he got, right, he still continued to do things well. So I'm going to read now my ario that I wrote yesterday. So two days ago, when I first saw the email from Dan, I came home and I saw it. I was like, I couldn't believe it. Like I said, I printed out all the poetry of his online that I could find, his interviews, and I was just spending the whole evening with that. When I went to sleep, he was the last thing on my mind. Uh, when I woke up, first thing on my mind, and as I was taking this like long walk, it was like 90 minutes or so, and just like these like thoughts started coming to me, like, okay, well, I could write an ario, like perhaps maybe not in his style, but maybe in my own style, right? Um, and these lines started coming, and then sure enough, when I got home from my walk, I just sat down and I started writing them down. And again, these are going to appear right on the page. So like when I was walking, like the main thought that I had was like, all right, I'm gonna have to come home and I'm gonna have to like change because he's contributing to the website. I'm gonna have to like change his bio, right? It was like a simple one line bio. I'm gonna have to change is to was.
Mm.
And this like struck me as like very kind of sad. So that's what I went with as I was walking. This is the thought that was through my mind. So I titled it Adding a Small Biographical Note Under the Author's Name for Bruce Ario. I should hate to bruise that button every time it pushes me to change tenses. He was once a poet, feels meaningless to thread, a rug worn out with all the living grammar of a scold. Continuing is pitiful. How the extant must arrange their flowers for their utmost bones, plucking out the parched ones cold to heat's travails. Why weren't the living told? Right. And when I sent this to Keith Jackowicz and I sent this to you, both of you actually had the same exact response, which was, you know, this is good poetry, but it doesn't have the Ario feel, right? There's something very, very distinctive about Bruce's poetry, right? And it makes sense, right? If you're going to be a great poet, if you're going to be a great artist of any sort, it's not supposed to be easy to just imitate your feel, your style, even if you could do let's say great poetry in a form that's created by this poet or whatever. It's still not going to have that same feel, right? Nobody, for instance, has done free verse that feels more or less like Walt Whitman's, right? That's not to say there hasn't been equally great free verse written since then. There has been, but it doesn't read like Walt Whitman. Just like these Arios, you could have the structure, you could have the form, you could even have some of the thematic conceits, some of the content could be the same, but it's going to feel different, right? It doesn't have that Bruce spirit, right? I think Keith said something like, he definitely has this sense that Bruce like embodies like the entire spirit of a poet, right? He has like a poet's soul, is what he said. And it may sound like kind of trite to say, but it's also kind of true, right? There's something very much like that within him, right? Whereas like if you talk to Dan, right? Dan is more straight. He could start cursing. He has these things that seem kind of inelegant into poetry, even if they're good, right? But there's a kind of elegance to Bruce that I'm glad will still be in the poetry.
Well, it reminds me of the old saying, is a memory a thing that you have or a thing that you've lost? And it's actually both. And that's the thing. We may have lost Bruce Ario, the person, since we were talking of personhood, the person of Bruce Ario is gone, but the mind and the art and the essence of Bruce Ario is the words. Every artist becomes their art. Shakespeare is not the stiff that's under Avon. Orson Welles is not the debonair debauchee that made films on a shoestring budget mostly, and on and on. So, when an artist is dead, a lot of the hate dissipates. Jessica's always saying maybe people stop hating you once you die, meaning me. And so now Bruce is. She was saying Bruce is of the ages, so he's someone that who is where there will never be another Ario written, or at least not a Bruce
Mm-hmm.
Ario written. I do hope that lots of Arios are written. I think that
Yes.
I think that a lot of poets, not just people with mental or addictive personality stuff, you can learn a lot from Bruce. And he was a good man. He was at his best a great poet. And I don't know if there's anything more that's vital to say about him.
Yeah, I think we could end it here.